Theirs was the kind of marriage that looked perfect from the outside. A beautiful home, luxurious vacations, and social gatherings filled with laughter and expensive wine. They were the couple that friends envied, the ones that people whispered about at parties. They have it all. But inside that grand house, behind those polished smiles, there was a different story being written. For years, he had endured the quiet erosion of his confidence, the slow and deliberate dismantling of his self-worth. His wife, a woman who once looked at him with admiration, now regarded him with nothing but disdain. She had a way of making him feel insignificant with just a glance, a slight smirk, a careless shrug. It didn't start that way, of course. In the beginning, she had been charming, supportive even, admiring his intelligence and work ethic. She told him she believed in his dreams, that together they would build a future worth living. He worked tirelessly, determined to give her everything she wanted: security, comfort, a life without worry. And for a time, she seemed happy. But something changed along the way. Perhaps it was when she climbed the corporate ladder, becoming more independent, more confident in her own success. Or maybe it was when she started surrounding herself with a different crowd, people who valued wealth and power over kindness and loyalty. Whatever it was, he could feel it, the shift in the air, the way her words cut deeper, the way her laughter at his expense grew louder. She found fault in everything he did. The way he dressed, the way he spoke, even the way he walked into a room. You could at least try to look important, she would sneer when they attended social gatherings. People will start thinking I'm married beneath me. At first, he brushed it off, telling himself she was just stressed from work, that she didn't mean it. But the comments never stopped. They became sharper, more frequent, more public. And worst of all, they started to sink in. He found himself second-guessing everything, questioning whether he truly was as mediocre as she claimed. It wasn't just words, she had a way of making him feel invisible. She barely acknowledged his presence at home, preferring to scroll through her phone or lose herself in conversations with friends who saw him as nothing more than an accessory. The few times he tried to speak up, to remind her of the man she once loved, she laughed. "You wouldn't last a day without me," she would say. And maybe she was right. After all, she had the high-paying job, the social connections, the influence. What did he have? A steady but unremarkable job? A heart that still foolishly hoped things would change? But things wouldn't change. They only got worse. And one day, when she threw the divorce papers on the table with a smirk, he knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. "Sign them," she said. "It's not like you have anything to fight for." And just like that, his world shattered. She wanted a man who was strong, successful, and admired. A man who could command attention simply by walking into a room. She thought she had married that man, but over the years, she convinced herself otherwise. To her, he was nothing more than an ordinary, unimpressive disappointment. She criticized his career choices, belittled his ambitions, and rolled her eyes at his dreams. "Maybe if you had some actual drive, I wouldn't have to work so hard to maintain our lifestyle," she'd say, sipping on a glass of wine, her designer-clad legs crossed with indifference. At social events, she made a habit of downplaying his contributions to their life together. "Oh, he just works in finance," she would say with a dismissive wave when people asked about his job. "But I'm the one keeping us afloat." And when the laughter followed, he would force a smile, swallowing the bitterness that threatened to rise in his throat. Because what was the point of arguing? No one would believe that it was he who had helped fund her business, that without his steady income in the early years, she wouldn't have had the financial security to take risks, to build her empire. But she didn't care about those details. She only cared about the story she had crafted, the one where she was the self-made woman and he was just the man who was lucky enough to be in her orbit. And as he sat across from her in their lavish home, staring at the divorce papers, he realized something: she wasn't just ending their marriage. She was erasing him entirely. It was easy for her to forget the sacrifices he had made, the long nights he spent working overtime to ensure they could afford their first apartment, the times he went without so she could chase her ambitions. She rewrote history as if he had never been there at all. In her version, she had built everything on her own, dragging along a man who contributed nothing but a paycheck too small for her growing expectations. She acted as if she had always been successful, as if she hadn't needed him to believe in her when no one else did. She never acknowledged that it was his unwavering support that gave her the freedom to take risks, to quit her stable job and start a business when the future was uncertain. She ignored the fact that while she was building her dream, he was working tirelessly to make sure they never struggled financially. Now, sitting in that cold, sterile courtroom, she stared at him with amusement, fully expecting the judge to grant her everything she asked for. "He doesn't deserve a cent," she said, her voice dripping with arrogance. "He contributed nothing to this marriage." The audience chuckled, the judge looked unimpressed, and he sat there, silent, as the weight of her words settled in. The divorce proceedings were brutal, not because he wanted to fight, but because she wanted to humiliate him one last time. She paraded into the courtroom like she had already won, dressed in designer clothes, exuding the confidence of a woman who believed she was untouchable. "Let's not waste anyone's time," she told the judge. "I earned everything." He was just there. And for a moment, he considered letting her have it. Maybe it would be easier that way, to walk away, to let her rewrite history the way she wanted. But then he thought about all the years he had given, all the things she had conveniently forgotten. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something he had almost forgotten he had. The courtroom was filled with a quiet anticipation, the kind that lingers before a spectacle unfolds. She sat confidently, her polished nails tapping impatiently against the wooden table, a smirk playing on her lips as if the trial was nothing more than a mere formality. To her, this was a performance, one where she was the triumphant protagonist, and he was the pitiful man being discarded like an old relic. "Your Honor," her lawyer began, "this case is simple. My client built everything from the ground up. Her financial success, her thriving business, none of it has any connection to the man sitting across from her." She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at him with barely concealed amusement, as if daring him to object. The judge nodded, listening carefully, while murmurs rippled through the room. Some spectators chuckled quietly, clearly entertained by the idea of a man being utterly outmatched by his ex-wife. He sat still, hands folded neatly on the table, allowing her lawyer to continue the well-rehearsed monologue. "This marriage was a financial burden for my client," the attorney continued. "She was the sole provider, the one who carried all responsibilities, while he merely existed." The words were cruelly chosen, meant to strip him of any semblance of value, and he heard the low hum of laughter from the gallery. Even the judge's brows lifted slightly at the blatant disdain in the statement. But he remained quiet, absorbing every insult, every dismissal of his worth. Because soon, none of it would matter. The judge cleared his throat, signaling for order, but the damage had been done. The courtroom was alive with murmurs, some pitying glances cast in his direction, others openly mocking. His ex-wife basked in the moment, leaning back slightly, exuding confidence. She had always known how to control a room, how to twist the narrative in her favor. To her, this was nothing more than another victory in a long line of conquests. "Your Honor," she finally spoke, her voice carrying a sharp edge, "this man contributed nothing significant to our life together. I was the one who worked tirelessly. I was the one who made the sacrifices. And now, he has the audacity to demand a share of what I built." She scoffed, shaking her head. "This is just another attempt to leech off my success." There it was. The final, public declaration of his insignificance. The gallery responded with subtle nods, quiet chuckles. He was just another forgotten man, one who had been lucky to stand beside her for as long as he had. And yet, as the whispers of agreement filled the air, as the weight of her words attempted to suffocate him, something within him stirred. For years, he had allowed her to rewrite history, to shape the perception of their marriage into whatever suited her. But now, he realized, he had something she didn't, the truth. He exhaled slowly, lifting his gaze to meet hers. She was already reveling in what she thought was her inevitable victory, barely even paying attention to him anymore. But when he shifted in his seat, when he finally straightened his posture, something flickered across her face, an almost imperceptible hesitation. It was the first crack in her unwavering confidence. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I have remained silent while my ex-wife and her counsel have painted a very deliberate picture of our marriage. A picture in which I was nothing more than a burden." He paused, letting his words settle, ensuring that every eye in the room was on him. Then, with measured precision, he reached into his folder and retrieved a set of documents. But the reality is far from what has been presented here today. He slid the papers across the table, the sound slicing through the tense air. The judge, curious, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward to examine them. His ex-wife's smirk faltered ever so slightly as she watched the judge's expression change. "What is this?" she asked, her voice losing its earlier confidence. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the weight of the revelation take its time, let her stew in the unease that was slowly creeping into her carefully constructed facade. Finally, he spoke, his tone steady, unwavering. "These," he said, gesturing to the documents, "are financial records. Years of transactions, investments, and payments. They prove that everything you claim to have built on your own was, in fact, funded by me." For the first time since the proceedings began, silence filled the room. No more chuckles, no more whispers of amusement. Even the judge, who had maintained a neutral expression up until now, was visibly intrigued. His ex-wife reached forward hastily, flipping through the pages, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The numbers were undeniable. Bank transfers, business startup funds, loans taken under his name, all meticulously documented. The very foundation of her argument, the belief that she had achieved everything alone, was crumbling before her eyes. This can't be right," she muttered, but the lack of conviction in her voice betrayed her. Her lawyer, visibly rattled, tried to regain control. "Objection, Your Honor. This information is irrelevant," but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "On the contrary," he said, his tone measured, "this is very relevant." He turned his gaze back to her. "Is it true that your business was initially financed by your ex-husband?" The room held its breath, waiting for her response. She hesitated, her mind scrambling for an escape, for a way to twist this revelation to her advantage. But there was none. The truth was out, and it was merciless. She had always believed that control was hers to wield, that no matter what, she could dictate how people saw her, saw him. But now, as the weight of evidence loomed over her, she felt the room slipping away from her grasp. I I was the one who made the business successful, she finally stammered, her voice lacking the confidence it once held. He may have helped in the beginning, but it was my work that built it into what it is today. It was a weak defense, and everyone knew it. The murmurs that once mocked him had now turned against her, skeptical whispers spreading through the courtroom. He didn't need to respond to her claim. The documents spoke for themselves. The judge exhaled, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "This changes the nature of the case significantly," he stated, his gaze shifting between them. "It appears that this is no longer a question of division of assets, but rather a question of who truly owns them." The words landed like a hammer, and the color drained from her face. For years, she had lived under the illusion that she was untouchable, that no one could challenge the story she had carefully curated. But now, here, in front of an entire courtroom, that illusion was unraveling thread by thread. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time in years, and saw something she hadn't expected: strength. He was no longer the quiet, submissive man who had allowed her to walk all over him. He had found his voice, and with it, he had taken back control of the narrative. She opened her mouth, desperate to salvage the situation, to claw back some semblance of dominance. But it was too late. The shift had already happened. The judge had seen the truth. The spectators had witnessed the downfall. And she, the woman who had once reveled in his humiliation, now sat frozen, forced to watch as the power she had wielded so effortlessly slipped from her grasp forever. The trial wasn't over yet, but one thing was certain: she had already lost. The courtroom, once filled with quiet snickers and whispers of amusement at his expense, was now consumed by a different kind of hush, one thick with disbelief. She sat stiffly, gripping the edges of the table as if anchoring herself against the reality unfolding before her. The judge tapped a pen against the stack of documents, his expression unreadable. "This evidence contradicts much of what has been presented today," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. It would seem that, contrary to the claims made, the plaintiff was not solely responsible for the financial success of the marriage. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. There was no room for manipulation, no space to twist the facts into something more favorable. The audience, who once viewed her as a strong, self-made woman, now studied her with narrowed eyes. She had built her power on the illusion of self-sufficiency, yet the documents before them shattered that perception. Every transaction, every deposit, every financial decision bore his fingerprints. He had been the foundation, the quiet force behind the empire she now tried to claim as solely her own. And now, exposed under the weight of undeniable truth, her carefully curated image was crumbling faster than she could salvage it. For the first time since the trial had begun, all eyes were no longer on him with pity, but on her, with scrutiny. The shift was almost tangible, like a tide that had receded just enough to reveal the wreckage beneath the surface. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the documents once more before addressing her lawyer. "Given this new information, does your client wish to amend her claims?" he asked, though the question was more of a command. Her lawyer hesitated, clearly thrown off balance. His carefully prepared arguments were now worthless, and everyone knew it. She stiffened, her nails pressing into her palm. "Your Honor, she began, but her voice faltered. The words that once came so easily, the confidence that once dictated every conversation, had abandoned her. He watched as she struggled to regain control, but the reality was unavoidable. The court was no longer looking at him as the defeated ex-husband who had been cast aside. No, they were looking at her, the woman who had stood atop a pedestal of falsehoods and was now tumbling down. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of water, her movements no longer effortless, no longer poised. He had seen her wear confidence like armor, using sharp words and dismissive gestures as weapons to keep others in their place. But now, as the truth settled in, that armor cracked, exposing the raw edges of her fear. He almost felt pity, almost. But then he remembered the years of belittlement, the way she had diminished him in front of others, twisting every sacrifice he had made into something insignificant. No, she had chosen this path. Now she would walk it alone. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "We will need to reevaluate the division of assets," he stated. "It would appear that Mr. Carter's contributions have been significantly understated." The murmurs that rippled through the courtroom were different now, no longer amusement at his supposed failure, but shock at how deeply she had miscalculated. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but she barely reacted, her mind clearly spinning. She had played this game assuming she would win. But now, for the first time, she realized she was losing. She forced a laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "Your Honor, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice brittle. "Yes, my ex-husband provided some financial support, but I was the one who took the risks. I was the one who built the business, who made the crucial decisions." She paused, searching for affirmation, but none came. Even the judge, who had initially regarded her with impartial patience, now wore an expression of growing impatience. "Miss Montgomery," he interrupted, "financial contribution is not merely about risk. It is about investment, sacrifice, and the foundation that allowed those risks to be taken. And by the evidence presented today, your ex-husband's role in that foundation was far more significant than you previously claimed." She clenched her jaw, her grip on control slipping like sand through her fingers. He watched, silent but steady, as she scrambled for footing. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in their long, exhausting battle, she was the one on the defensive. "We request a recess," her lawyer blurted out, desperate to stall, to regroup. The judge sighed but nodded. "We will reconvene in 30 minutes. The gavel struck, but the sound barely registered over the deafening realization in her mind. This was no longer the victory she had envisioned. This was survival. As the courtroom emptied for recess, he remained seated, his fingers pressed together in quiet contemplation. He could feel the weight of what had just happened, the monumental shift in perception. He had entered this courtroom prepared for defeat, prepared to accept whatever she deemed him worthy of. But now, as the reality of her unraveling became clearer, he realized something else. He was winning, but not just in court. He was winning himself back. She, however, was far from composed. She stormed into the hallway, her lawyer trailing behind her in frantic whispers. He watched as she ran a hand through her hair, her polished composure cracking under the weight of her frustration. This wasn't how she had imagined today would go. She had expected an easy dismissal, a court full of laughter at his expense. Instead, she had been blindsided, forced to confront the truth she had spent years denying. And worst of all, everyone had seen it. He had always imagined that if he ever won, it would come with fanfare, with a dramatic moment that felt like justice served. But as he sat there, watching her unravel, he realized that true victory was much quieter. It was in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way the courtroom no longer echoed with the confidence she once wielded. It was in the way people now looked at him, with respect, not pity. And most importantly, it was in the way he felt within himself, lighter, freer. As he stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, he felt something unfamiliar settle over him. For years, he had carried the weight of her words, the burden of her disdain. But now, standing here with the truth finally spoken, with the illusion shattered, he understood the greatest truth of all: he had never been the weak one. She had. And as the courtroom doors opened once more, signaling the next round of proceedings, he smiled to himself. For the first time in years, he was truly ready. When court resumed, she walked back to her seat with a noticeable change in demeanor. Gone was the air of effortless superiority, the quiet smirk she had worn like a crown. Now, there was tension in her shoulders, the stiffness of someone who had been blindsided and was desperately trying to regain control. Her lawyer sat beside her, speaking in hushed tones, but she barely reacted. She was too busy processing what had just happened, too focused on the way people were looking at her differently. The pity that had once been reserved for him now lingered in their eyes as they glanced at her. She hated it. He, on the other hand, was still. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in her discomfort. He had spent too many years feeling small to suddenly revel in someone else's downfall. But there was something undeniably powerful about the silence that had replaced the courtroom's earlier laughter. It was a silence she couldn't manipulate, one she couldn't twist in her favor. And she knew it. That knowledge sat heavy in her chest, constricting, suffocating. She had entered this trial expecting a clean victory, a decisive win that would cement her narrative. Now, she wasn't sure if she would win at all. Her lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he stood. "Your Honor, given the new evidence, we would like to propose a settlement," he said, his voice measured but urgent. The words made her flinch, though she tried to mask it. A settlement. The very idea was an admission of weakness, a public acknowledgement that she no longer had control over the case. And yet, she said nothing, because she knew there was no other choice. If this trial continued, if more evidence surfaced, she could lose even more than just her dignity. The judge leaned back in his chair, considering the request. "Mr. Carter, do you have any objections?" All eyes turned to him, waiting for his response. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the moment. A settlement meant closure, it meant walking away with a clear victory, with the acknowledgement that he was never the man she painted him to be. But it also meant letting her escape the full consequences of her lies. He could end it now, or he could see it through to the bitter end. And for the first time in years, he had the power to decide. He glanced at her, and for the first time in their long, bitter history, she was looking at him with uncertainty. Not disdain, not condescension, uncertainty. It was strange, seeing her like this, stripped of the arrogance she had always carried so effortlessly. "I appreciate the offer," he said finally, his voice steady, "but I think I'd prefer to let the court decide." A collective hush fell over the room, and for a split second, she looked at him in disbelief. She had expected him to take the easy way out, to grasp at any opportunity to avoid further confrontation. But he wasn't the same man anymore. Her lawyer visibly tensed, exchanging a quick, uneasy glance with her. They had hoped to end this quietly, to salvage what little remained of her image. But now, the trial would continue, and the full extent of her deceit would be laid bare. She forced a tight smile, but the flicker of panic in her eyes betrayed her. He wasn't backing down. And for the first time in her life, she realized she had no control over what happened next. The judge nodded, his face betraying no emotion. "Very well. We will proceed." The gavel struck once, final and absolute, and she flinched at the sound. He watched her carefully, taking in every subtle movement, every crack in her once impenetrable facade. She was unraveling, and she knew it. But she was also calculating, always looking for a way to twist the situation back in her favor. He had spent years watching her manipulate conversations, spinning lies with the ease of someone who had never faced consequences. Would she try again now? Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgent, but she barely nodded, barely responded. She was still absorbing the reality of what had just happened. She had assumed he would take the settlement, that he would jump at the first opportunity to end this. But he had made a choice, a deliberate, empowered choice. And in doing so, he had stolen from her the one thing she had always counted on, certainty. The trial continued with a new energy, a new dynamic that shifted in his favor with every passing second. His lawyer presented more documents, more evidence of his contributions, his sacrifices. The financial records were only the beginning. Next came the testimonies, mutual friends, former colleagues, even her own business associates who had witnessed firsthand the way she had rewritten history. Each one chipped away at her credibility, each one another nail in the coffin of the persona she had so carefully crafted. She sat through it all, her face unreadable, but he could see it, the tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled against the fabric of her dress. She was unraveling piece by piece, her once impenetrable walls crumbling with every revelation. And the people who had once laughed at him, who had dismissed him as nothing more than a footnote in her success, were now looking at her with something new in their eyes, doubt. It happened so subtly that he almost missed it, the exact moment she knew she had lost. It wasn't when the judge frowned at her lawyer's weak rebuttals, or when the financial evidence became impossible to deny. It was when the spectators, the very people she had once counted on to admire her, to believe in her, stopped seeing her the way she wanted to be seen. There was no admiration left in their eyes, no envy. Just curiosity, skepticism, and a little bit of pity. That was what broke her. Not the documents, not the testimonies, but the realization that she was no longer in control of how people saw her. And for someone like her, someone who had built an entire life around perception, that was worse than any ruling the judge could hand down. As the final statements were made, the courtroom was eerily quiet, the weight of everything that had transpired hanging heavy in the air. The judge folded his hands, his gaze settling on both of them. This court has heard significant evidence that contradicts the claims made by the plaintiff, he began, his voice steady. It is clear that Mr. Carter's contributions have been substantial and that the initial presentation of this case was misleading at best. She inhaled sharply, but she didn't interrupt. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say, no argument left to make. This was the moment she had dreaded, the moment she had fought so hard to avoid. But there was no escaping the truth now. The ruling came swiftly, decisively. The division of assets was adjusted heavily in his favor. The judge made it clear that her initial attempts to manipulate the case had backfired, and any sympathy she might have had was now long gone. He was awarded a fair share, more than she had ever imagined he would walk away with. And yet, as the courtroom reacted, as murmurs of shock spread through the audience, he felt something even greater than satisfaction. He felt free. For years, he had carried the weight of her judgment, the belief that he was nothing without her validation. But now, as he stood tall, as she sat frozen in disbelief, he finally understood the truth. He had never needed her approval. He had never been the failure she painted him to be. And now, for the first time in his life, he was done proving himself to anyone. She sat motionless, her hands curled into fists on her lap as the judge's words rang in her ears. The courtroom had become a theater of judgment, but now, she was no longer the admired protagonist, she was the antagonist whose deception had been exposed. The murmurs from the gallery grew louder, whispers of disbelief, of quiet amusement at how the mighty had fallen. Her lawyer, still reeling from the disastrous turn of events, leaned in and whispered something urgently, but she barely registered his words. All she could hear was the sound of her own downfall. Across from her, he remained still, composed, yet there was something undeniable in his posture: relief. He had won, but more than that, he had reclaimed something she had stolen from him long before the trial had begun: his dignity. He no longer needed to prove himself, no longer felt the weight of her judgment pressing down on his shoulders. He had carried the burden of her words for too long, allowed them to shape the way he saw himself. But now, she was the one drowning in scrutiny, not him. When the judge finalized the ruling, the room fell into a stunned silence. He was awarded a fair share of their assets, far more than she had ever anticipated. The business she had claimed to build alone, the home she had once dismissed as entirely hers, the investments she had tried to erase from his name, all now legally acknowledged as his contributions, his sacrifices. She had walked into this courtroom expecting to leave him with nothing, to crush him under the weight of her influence. But instead, she had destroyed herself. The judge stood, signaling the trial was over, and the sound of the gavel striking the wood felt like the closing of a chapter, one she would never be able to rewrite. He turned to leave, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no gloating in his expression, no malice. Only certainty. And that, more than anything, shattered her. Because for the first time since she had met him, she was the one who felt small. The days after the trial were filled with silence. The calls from friends who once admired her stopped, the invitations to exclusive events ceased. She had become something she never imagined she would be: irrelevant. She could still feel the stares, the quiet judgment from people who had once looked at her with admiration. They had seen her lose. And in her world, losing meant disappearing. Meanwhile, he had moved on. She heard about it through whispers, how he had taken control of his life, how he had started anew. People who once dismissed him now respected him, saw him as someone who had endured, who had emerged stronger. He wasn't bitter, he wasn't consumed by vengeance, he was simply free. And that realization cut deeper than anything the court had ruled against her. Because while she had spent years believing she was the one in control, she had never been able to control him the way she thought she did. She told herself she didn't care, that she would rebuild, that she would find a way to return to the top. But the world had changed, and she no longer had the power she once wielded so effortlessly. And so, in a moment of desperation, she did the one thing she had sworn she never would: she reached out to him. A simple message, carefully crafted to appear casual, as if they were two people with unfinished business rather than former adversaries in a public battle. "We should talk," she wrote. "Maybe we can find a way to move forward." When she sent the message, she waited, staring at the screen, expecting a response. Maybe he would want closure. Maybe he would still feel something: anger, resentment, even a need for reconciliation. But minutes passed, then hours, then days. And there was nothing. No reply. She had spent years making him feel invisible. Now, she was the one who no longer existed in his world. He saw the message, read it once, then again, before setting the phone down without responding. There was nothing left to say. The version of himself who might have been tempted to answer, to seek some kind of resolution, no longer existed. He didn't need closure from her, he had already found it in himself. He had spent so much of his life believing he had to prove his worth to her, to fight against the narrative she had built around him. But now, as he stood in the life he had built for himself, he realized he had never needed her validation. There was something powerful in that realization, something freeing. He had spent years under her shadow, believing he was nothing without her. But as he watched the sun rise outside his window, as he embraced the quiet peace of a life no longer dictated by her expectations, he understood the truth. She had never been the one defining him. He had simply forgotten that he was capable of defining himself. She expected him to come back in some way, to acknowledge her, even if it was just to reject her outright. But he never did. Days turned into weeks, then months, and in time, she had to accept what had once been unthinkable. He had erased her from his life completely. There was no anger, no lingering resentment. He simply didn't care anymore. And that, more than anything, was the final consequence of what she had done. She had built a life around control, around ensuring that people saw her exactly as she wanted to be seen. But in doing so, she had failed to see the one truth that mattered: control is an illusion. And now, as she sat alone, scrolling through a list of unread messages, of invitations no longer extended, of doors that had quietly closed on her, she realized that she had lost more than just a court case. She had lost the one thing she had always assumed she would never lose: the power to make him care. And as he moved forward, living a life she would never again be a part of, she understood this was her true punishment. Not losing money, not losing status, but losing the ability to shape the way he saw himself. Because in the end, the greatest revenge was not hatred. It was indifference.